Few people had heard of the small St. Louis suburb of Ferguson, Missouri before August 9, 2014, when Michael Brown, an unarmed 18-year-old African-American, was killed by a white police officer. Members of the Inclusive Collective, based at the University of Illinois, Chicago, just returned from a justice retreat to Ferguson, where they explored the aftermath of the shooting and the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement. For more, let's welcome Matthew Adams, Deanna Christensen, and Tito Ponce from the Inclusive Collective. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Matthew, let's start with you. Tell us why you wanted to go on this pilgrimage and what started it, what prompted it.
Well, I joined the Inclusive Collective back in my sophomore year at Wheaton College, and the group is really passionate about justice, and ever since I went to a school where it was predominantly white, I was yearning for a community that focused on issues of justice. So when we had this retreat coming up to go to Ferguson, it just was something that I needed to be a part of.
What was the focus of the trip?
Yeah, the focus of the trip was looking at justice within St. Louis. At least that's, for me, that was my focus of the trip. We got to go to the Deaconess Center for Children, I believe, and we also got to go to where Mike Brown was shot and killed, and we also had the opportunity to see a production by the Black Rep Theater, and a lot of these things focused on the Black freedom struggle here in America. It's still going on today, and yeah, that was really the biggest things. Those are some of the big topics that we focused on the trip.
Deanna, what were your expectations going on this pilgrimage?
I have been really concerned about issues of racial justice since the summer of 2012. I had grown up in a really white small town and hadn't really had to think about my own race until I spent a summer in Atlanta working with and being in community with people who were very different from me for the first time. And I was really shocked and disappointed at the way that the church has been not on the forefront of these issues, but really falling behind on these issues. And I ended up getting involved in the Inclusive Collective as a grad student at UIC. So my expectation on trips like this is I, as a white person, am not forced to think about race ever. So I see it as my duty as a Christian and as a privileged person to put myself in situations where I'm confronted with my whiteness and confronted with racial injustice. So for me, this trip was about being reminded of those things and about being fueled to continue addressing those issues.
Well, Tito, what were your first impressions when you arrived to Ferguson? Was it what you expected?
So immediately as we got there, we're all piled up in this 15-person van. We had 2 fans going, so we had 30 people there. And it's fun and joking. We're having a good time building community, and almost immediately the next day, on Saturday, things got really serious. Just in a somber tone of knowing the gravity of why we were there. But we were also welcomed with open arms from Reverend Starsky there, who worked at the Deaconess Center, was a part of St. John's Church. Yeah, so I guess my initial impressions were knowing that the weekend was going to be tough, knowing that we were going to dive deep and challenge a lot of our inner beliefs for some folks, and knowing that there was going to be tension. But we were all met with grace, able to hold each other with grace. Yeah, it was a emotionally charged experience, but left feeling good about having gone.
And Matthew, it's been 5 years since the shooting. What has changed?
I don't think much has changed, especially in terms of the shootings that still happen when it comes to Black men, Black women, Black people in general just getting shot by the police. So it was definitely a somber experience getting to stand there and see where Mike Brown was murdered. It was a lot to deal with, and I don't really know, I can't really speak to what's changed in that area because I've never been there before. So for me, it was a fresh perspective that I was also able to see the impact that has left, to see that where Mike Brown laid had to be excavated and repaved because the blood tarnished the ground. So it was a crazy experience to see exactly how that moment has affected the community.
And Deanna, what did you learn about the Black Lives Movement maybe that you didn't know before going on this trip?
It was really, really cool to get to talk to the people who were there at the beginning, and to hear about those first 24 hours, 48 hours from their perspective. I feel like, especially in the media, people who were protesting were kind of vilified by the media, and these protests were described as riots. But we got to hear from people who were on the ground just about how well organized these protests were. And, folks, clergy members were involved and people of faith were involved in.
Their fight continues. There's a lot of us, like we said, it's 5 years since this happened, and Ferguson may be in the back of our minds, but for them, they're still continuing this fight and living this every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually hearing from Reverend Starsky, he's the CEO of the Deaconess Center, which is an advocacy center for children. They're positioned right next to a juvenile detention center, and so one of their biggest projects right now is trying to get that detention center shut down. So they're still fighting the fight around police brutality, but also just advocacy for children in St. Louis and Ferguson in general.
That's great. And Tito, so what lessons did you learn from this weekend, and how can you apply it and put it into action here in Chicago?
This is our third Justice Retreat, Justice Pilgrimage as the Inclusive Collective. And each year we learn something new. And so we've gotten a lot of feedback from students about wanting to make sure that we leave not feeling empty-handed and leaving that we feel like we know what to do, or that we can take everything that we've learned and do something with it. So this year we tried out something new. We used some resources from the Forum for Theological Exploration around discernment, specifically how as a group we can discern what our next most faithful steps is, or just what's the next actionable thing that we can do. And so we used some design thinking principles as a group to talk about and just ideate about where our pain points in our communities, because for some of us we are experiencing injustices from a variety of different identities. And so where do we see those intersections, and who can we have in our playing field to be on our teams to help take next steps? So I think for me, I definitely took a lot in terms of just like how to be an empathetic listener, knowing that there are people in our space who are having different touch points with justice issues. And so how do you meet in the middle for a lot of these folks to start the conversation, to continue the conversation? And I think for me, my most faithful steps were probably just to start feeling comfortable having these conversations with friends and family. That way these ideas don't get stuck in my silo, and I can spread them out.
Right. And Matthew, what would you say some of the action steps that someone who's watching this can take away?
For someone who's watching this, I feel the best thing for people to do is just get educated on what's happening with areas of justice, see what's happening when it comes to police shootings, what's happening to issues of justice in your community, whether it be juvenile detention centers, whether it be just inconsistencies within how police officers treat black and brown people in comparison to white people. Taking every moment and actually unpacking it for what it is, and not really taking our preconceived notions into things that are happening in the media.
Deanna, same question to you. In your own community, what kind of actions will you now take?
This is the third Justice Pilgrimage that I've been on with the Inclusive Collective too, and what always rings in my ears after these experiences, the phrase, go talk to your people. So I really feel called to be a bridge builder and an advocate as a white person, and to be an advocate for racial justice in my network of people who might not who are either apathetic about these issues or who don't believe that racial injustice is still a problem. I feel that responsibility both as a white person and as a Christian, and I feel called to claim authority as the church and say, like, this is stuff God cares about.
Matthew, Deanna, and Tito, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experiences and from Ferguson.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Anne Marie Gerhardt for Different Drummers and the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries. Keep the faith.